Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. Last week, during the governor's State of the State address, a group of Rhode Islanders planned to protest in the State House rotunda, but they couldn't. The area was roped off and guarded by state and Capitol Police. They said the space was reserved by the governor's administration, but no one used it. Now, the ACLU is considering a First Amendment lawsuit. Here to tell us more about what happened is Harrison Tuttle, president of the Black Lives Matter Rhode Island PAC, and Steve Brown, executive director of the ACLU of Rhode Island. Harrison Tuttle and Steve Brown, thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so much.
So Harrison, to start with, bring us up to speed on what happened before Governor Dan McKee's 2025 State of the State address on Tuesday, January 14th. You were planning a protest. What was it about, and where and when was it going to be?
Our protest was meant to be a forum for Rhode Islanders all across the state to have their voice heard. Many of Rhode Islanders are living paycheck to paycheck, unable to pay for basic necessities such as housing and food. And so we really felt like it was important during this moment in time that Rhode Islanders had their voice heard. We had planned on having the People's State of the State in the Rhode Island State House Rotunda. We announced it a day before, but organizing was well on its way before we announced. We had probably commitments from a couple of hundred people about a week out from the People's State of the State. So we were really well organized, and the people knew what they wanted, and the people were pretty disappointed based on what happened.
Yeah, when did you realize that you were not going to be able to use the rotunda for this protest?
We had gotten word from Steve Alquist, who's a reporter. When he was there around 11 to 12, they were putting up barriers. It was unclear as to if they were going to barrier off both sides of the rotunda, but we knew that they were preparing for something.
What did you see when you got to the State House?
When I had walked up to the rotunda, I was greeted by Capitol Police with kind of this, "Hey, how are you?" Just small talk. But as the night escalated and as more people began to come, we got word that the rotunda was booked. That is when I began to announce to the people who were attending and everyone at the State House that the rotunda was being blocked from the People's State of the State. I had been told that I was exclusively banned from the rotunda per orders of the governor.
You by name?
Me by name.
Why was the rotunda blocked off? What was the reason given?
The reason that the Rhode Island Capitol Police gave me was that this was going to be a part of the State of the State.
And where was the State of the State speech given?
In the House of Representatives.
Was the rotunda used?
No.
So it was vacant, it was empty while the speech was given?
The entire speech and prior to the speech, the rotunda was just occupied by Rhode Island Capitol Police.
So where did you move your event?
We moved our event to the only place in which the State House provided us, which was the Bell Room, which is on the opposite end of the entrance towards the State House on the Smith Street side.
They told you to go there?
They told us to go there, and as the night unfolded, they continuously restricted our movement to exclusively that area as to how we were able to use our freedom of speech.
Was it as effective to hold the protest in the Bell area, in the Bell Room, than it was to hold it in the rotunda?
The reason why we held it in the rotunda was because we knew it would be visible, and we knew that it would be accessible to individuals to be able to gather and have their voice heard. It was extremely difficult for individuals to hear due to the lack of accessibility to a microphone, in which the Rhode Island Capitol Police would not allow. And so oftentimes we had folks who were older that were trying to give speeches that could not be heard because of the restrictions that were put on by the governor and by the Rhode Island Capitol Police.
Steve Brown, you've been at the ACLU for a while. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
No, certainly not at the State House. So, what's really interesting is the history of use of the rotunda. It was an ACLU lawsuit back in the 1970s. People were not allowed to use the rotunda for rallies or protests at all. There were a number of individuals working on poverty issues, including the Sisters of Mercy, who went to the State House one day to protest proposed budget cuts to the poor by the governor at that time.
Wow, this all sounds very familiar.
Yeah, Governor Noel. They were going to go and hold a peaceful singing and praying, and they were banned. And the ACLU filed a lawsuit, and it resulted in a court decision saying the rotunda is the people's meeting place. It needs to be open for the public to use. And as anybody who goes to the State House knows, it's a regular source of protests, rallies, demonstrations, news conferences, you name it. It's a very important place for freedom of speech.
Just for those who aren't familiar with it, describe where it is and why you, if you're holding a protest, if you want to get people's attention, why you would want to be there.
It's at a location where, first of all, you can be seen on all sides if you're in the rotunda. It's a convenient place for people to meet and gather. And it's also often where the action is. The second floor rotunda is where the House and the Senate meet. The governor's offices are on the second floor. It's just a logical place for people to meet if they want to engage in free speech activity.
I've been to Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park, where people have been standing on milk crates giving speeches about all kinds of things since the 1800s. Is this Rhode Island Speaker's Corner, is this the place to protest?
It's certainly one of the big places to protest. Every legislative session, you will have many, many days where the rotunda, the State House, is filled with people who are advocating on a particular hot-button issue. It can be gun control, abortion rights, poverty issues. These are all important issues, and this is the place where you want to make your voice heard.
So the ACLU lawsuit back then, did it establish that the public has a right to access that for protests and other events?
Yes, that was the ultimate. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean you can do it anytime, anywhere, anyway.
Right.
There are reasonable restrictions that can be set, but what the court ruling said is this is a forum that the public can use to engage in protest and rallies.
Is the ACLU thinking of taking any legal action regarding what the governor did at the State of the State speech?
Well, Harrison has asked us to consider that, and so we will be gathering information and having our legal committee review it in the coming weeks.
So a spokesperson for the governor's office told the Globe that the rotunda can be and has been reserved many times for events as it was for the State of the State address. Harrison, did you try to reserve it?
We did not, with the expectation that the governor would not allow us to book it for that purpose.
Did you know you had to? I mean, is that an expectation? Do you always have to?
There was an expectation that organizations in the past have booked the rotunda for accessibility, just like any other room. So if you wanted to book the library, for example, you would have to go and just give a call beforehand. In previous times, I've done that, and the Rhode Island State House has been very accommodating.
Steve, do groups usually reserve the rotunda, and do they have to?
They usually do. I think the reason to do it is you want to make sure there aren't any conflicts, that there isn't another rally that's being planned the same day. But it's our view that, if an emergency event happened, you think about the overturning of Roe versus Wade or George Floyd, if people want to gather quickly, with less than a day's notice, they ought to be able to do that. Again, there are legitimate limitations. Certainly the Capitol Police can make sure that passageways are not obstructed, but it's the people's house, and people ought to be able to go there without making a reservation. Again, it's useful to do that, but it should not be a requirement.
So since the rotunda wasn't used during this time, why do you think the governor reserved it?
Well, I have to assume it was to try to stifle the free speech activities of this group.
Have you ever seen the rotunda reserved and guarded by state police and Capitol Police?
Yes, I have. There have been times when parts of the rotunda have been cut off, and you'll see police there. I don't know if you see them in the force that I've been told, the number of police officers that were there. But for some special events, I mean, just this past year, a movie was being shot in the State House Rotunda, and people were prohibited from going to a number of places, which is fine. But this seems to have been a bit different. That it seems to have been aimed specifically at preventing this rally from taking place, as opposed to actually reserving it for real use. As Harrison said, and what I've heard is there was nobody at the rotunda this whole period of time. So the idea that it had to be reserved seems a little bit suspicious.
We'll have more with Harrison Tuttle and Steve Brown after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. Harrison, to get back to what happened that night, when the speech began, some protesters began to march around the State House. What happened next?
We began to march around the State House once the speaking program was concluded. It was kind of this collective decision that we made. It was not something that was planned, but we understood that the second and third floor was restricted. And so we said, well, if we're only getting the first floor, we might as well continue to have our voice heard. And so we began to exercise our First Amendment right by marching and chanting around the first floor.
What were you chanting?
Whose house? Our house. We were chanting for multiple chants around sheltering the homelessness, to address our housing crisis. At a certain point, probably around 3 or 4 times around, I myself saw a Capitol Police officer go and confront myself and others and tell us that we weren't allowed to continue to march, and that it was being described to us as something that was an inconvenience to the overall event that was going on the second and third floor, and that although I had asked multiple times to both the Rhode Island Capitol Police and the Rhode Island State Police, who were both there together, what was the law in which we were restricted from continuing to exercise our First Amendment right, one of the officers said, "We don't have to give that to you." So at that point, we were face to face with the Rhode Island Capitol Police, with individuals who are marginalized, who are affected by poverty. The last thing that we wanted to do was be in a situation in which those individuals were hurt or arrested by Rhode Island Capitol Police because of the actions ordered by the governor.
So were you asked to leave? Were you arrested?
We were pretty close to, in my opinion, being charged with disorderly conduct, although we do not believe that we were being disorderly in any way. We believe that we were using our First Amendment right. It was something that was very apparent to us that as the Rhode Island Capitol Police continued to see more and more people engaged and use their voice, they began to essentially make up rules as they went as to what we could and could not do, where we could stand and where we could not stand, and where we could use our voice and could not use our voice.
And eventually you were, I saw on TV news, you were escorted out.
Yeah, I attempted to go up to the second floor, in which I was cornered and grabbed by the Rhode Island State Police and escorted down to the first floor. It was threatened to me that I would get arrested if I did not comply.
So now let's talk about the First Amendment implications. The First Amendment does protect free speech rights, but courts have ruled that the government can place reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner of expression. So, Steve, was Governor McKee within his rights to reserve the rotunda and force the protesters into another part of the State House?
As a general rule, as I said, certainly the governor can reserve spaces in the State House for things like his State of the State speech. The question is whether in this particular instance it was a pretext for denying the free speech rights of this group. The fact that the rotunda was not, in fact, used in any meaningful way during that whole period of time. It's important to emphasize that free speech is important to be allowed on its own terms to the best extent possible. I mean, it's great to say you can have a rally at the State House, but only if nobody's in there, for example. The point, I assume, of having the rally right around the time of the governor's State of the State address was to make a message. And so the timing of it and the placement of it was a significant part of the message. So while, yes, it's true, the state does have the ability and the right to set certain reasonable limits, as you indicated, it should not be used as a way to really stifle the expression of speech.
Yeah, because the government can place restrictions on time, place, and manner, but it can't impose restrictions on the content of the speech. It can't be based on whether you like the content or not, right?
Exactly. And, the State of the State is, by its terms, something that happens every year. I've been up there many years, and the second floor has been open to the public, to lobbyists, to anybody who happens to be there. So it's not as if there's some history of the rotunda being closed off during the State of the State speech. And that, again, makes one question, what was the rationale behind it?
Harrison, in your view, was the restriction aimed at what the protesters were going to say? Was it because the governor didn't want to hear it?
I believe that the governor of Rhode Island exercised his power to restrict Rhode Islanders from providing an alternative view as to what the state of the state actually is. We talk about Rhode Islanders living paycheck to paycheck. Buying a home is completely out of the question for a majority of Rhode Islanders. And the reality is that we had a governor who, because he could, silenced not only myself, but other individuals in the state who were simply just wanting their voice to be heard.
So the First Amendment protects 5 freedoms besides free speech and freedom of the press. It protects the right to gather peacefully and seek change from the government. So, Harrison, was there anything that was not peaceful about your protest?
Our protest was peaceful. We had individuals ranging from children to elderly. At no point was the action violent or had any intentions of being violent.
The governor's office hasn't said much about this, but they might point out that the protest was allowed to happen. It did occur, just at another location in the State House. So, Steve, was there a problem if they got to speak somewhere else?
Potentially, yes. I mean, as I was just saying, sometimes where you speak is just as important as whether you have the right to speak. And so if they were shunted off to a location that really was not visible, that made it difficult for people to hear, then the question is whether they really were allowed to exercise their free speech rights in the way that they should have been able to.
Harrison, what message do you think this decision to rope off the rotunda sends?
The message that it sends is that we have a Rhode Island governor who, if he doesn't agree with the time and place in which Rhode Islanders are using their free speech, he will do everything in his power, including using police to prevent that from happening in the location in which the people want.
Steve, what message would you send to the governor about how his administration will handle future protests?
Well, freedom of speech is the cornerstone of any democracy, including here at the state level. Governors and all public officials should do their best to respect the rights of individuals, to exercise that right to free speech, to criticize government actions as happened here. All we can do is hope that it does not happen again, and we will certainly be keeping an eye out for that. I mean, the State House is just too important a symbolic place to try to stifle the exercise of free speech rights by people who want to come to the government and express their views.
One other issue was that the McKee administration blocked TV news stations from bringing cameras into the House chamber during the speech, meaning the only broadcast camera was from the state-controlled Capitol TV. Later, a spokesperson for the governor said there was a, quote, miscommunication resulting from a transition in staff, and next year they'll return to coordinating pooled access on the House floor. But, Steve, what did you make of that? And why is it important to have independent news outlets providing the footage of big state government events like this.
Yeah, it was really a double whammy for the First Amendment that night. I mean, between, what happened with the protest and then the ban on video cameras to be there for the State of the State speech, it was really troubling to see both of those things happen at the same time. It really is important that there be a video record made by people privately. When you have a state-run camera, it will be focused on probably the person speaking. What might be very interesting is to see the reactions of people in the chamber to what the governor is saying. And that's what having other reporters there videoing the event can do. Instead of relying on the state itself to tell you what you're able to see if you don't happen to actually be in the room.
Harrison, what do you hope comes out of this whole episode?
Well, I hope that our momentum, the movement of Rhode Islanders who continue to struggle, are encouraged to use their voice, contact their elected officials, and participate in the improvement of their own life, even if that means confronting power in a way in which, in this case, the governor did not want your voice heard. We are in such an incredible moment, and so many people right now have to make the decision of whether or not to pay their rent or to eat food that night. We hope that more Rhode Islanders' voices are heard so that we're able to actually have a state that long-term and short-term can take care of us all.
Harrison Tuttle, Steve Brown, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.